The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the Rocky Mountains of Afghanistan as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her headset inside the cramped M1A2 Abrams tank. The radio crackled with desperate voices from Navy SEALs trapped just 3 miles ahead. What had started as a routine reconnaissance mission had turned into a nightmare that would test every ounce of courage she possessed. Maria had grown up in a small Texas town where her father ran an auto repair shop. She learned to fix engines before she could properly ride a bicycle. Her hands were always dirty with grease, and her mind was always working on mechanical problems. When she turned 18, the military seemed like the perfect place to use her skills. Tank maintenance was supposed to be safe work, far from the front lines. But this morning was different. The forward operating base had received an urgent distress call at dawn. A 6-man SEAL team had been conducting a surveillance mission near the Pakistan border when they stumbled into a Taliban stronghold. What should have been empty mountains turned out to be crawling with enemy fighters. The SEALs had found cover behind some large rocks on a steep hillside, but they were completely surrounded. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves on higher ground, making it impossible for the Special Forces team to move. Every time one of the SEALs tried to change position, bullets would rain down from above. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the SEAL team leader, had been in combat for over 10 years. He had survived missions in Iraq, Syria, and multiple tours in Afghanistan. But this situation felt hopeless. His team was low on ammunition, and 2 of his men were already wounded. One had taken a bullet through his shoulder, while another had shrapnel in his leg from a grenade explosion. The morning had started so differently. Morrison's team had hiked through the mountains in darkness, using night vision goggles to navigate the treacherous terrain. Their mission was simple: observe and report on suspected enemy movement in the area. Intelligence suggested that high-value Taliban targets might be using this remote region as a safe passage between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Everything went wrong when the sun came up. As daylight revealed their position, the SEALs discovered they were not alone. Taliban fighters began emerging from hidden positions all around them. Within minutes, the surveillance mission became a fight for survival. Morrison tried calling for air support, but the nearest Apache helicopters were dealing with another emergency 2 hours away. Fighter jets could not provide close air support because the enemy positions were too close to the SEAL team. One wrong bombing run could kill the very people they were trying to save. The base commander, Colonel Sarah Hayes, studied the tactical maps in the operations center. She had 30 years of military experience, but this situation presented unique challenges. The SEALs were trapped in terrain that made rescue extremely difficult. Helicopter extraction was impossible due to heavy enemy fire. Ground forces would take too long to reach them, and the SEALs might not survive that long. Maria was performing routine maintenance on her tank when she heard the commotion in the operations center. As a tank mechanic, she usually stayed focused on her technical duties. But something about the urgent voices and rapid movement of personnel caught her attention. She wiped the grease from her hands and walked over to see what was happening. The situation became clear quickly. 6 brave men were going to die unless someone could reach them soon. The Taliban fighters had them pinned down with no escape route. Traditional rescue methods were not working, and time was running out fast. Colonel Hayes was considering her limited options when Maria stepped forward. She had been studying the terrain maps over the shoulders of the tactical officers. Her mechanical mind was already working on a solution that others had not considered. The route to the SEAL position was treacherous mountain terrain that seemed impossible for vehicles to navigate. The paths were narrow, rocky, and steep. Most military vehicles would never make it through such challenging landscape. But Maria understood something that the tactical planners were missing. Her M1A2 Abrams tank was not just a weapon system. It was an incredibly capable off-road vehicle designed to handle the worst possible terrain. The tank's tracks could grip surfaces that would stop wheeled vehicles. Its powerful engine could climb slopes that seemed impossible. Most importantly, its heavy armor could withstand the kind of enemy fire that was keeping rescue helicopters away. Maria approached Colonel Hayes with her idea. The room fell silent as she explained her plan. She would drive her tank through the mountains, using terrain that the Taliban would never expect a vehicle to navigate. The element of surprise would be crucial to the mission's success. The plan was dangerous beyond imagination. Maria would be driving alone through enemy territory with no backup support. If her tank broke down or became stuck, she would be trapped in hostile territory with no way to escape. The Taliban fighters would certainly try to destroy her tank with rocket-propelled grenades and other anti-vehicle weapons. But Morrison's team was running out of time. Radio reports indicated that the Taliban fighters were moving closer to the SEAL position. They were preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm the trapped Americans. Something had to be done immediately, or 6 Special Forces operators would not be coming home. Colonel Hayes made the difficult decision to authorize Maria's rescue mission. It was a desperate plan with very low chances of success, but it was the only option available. Maria would have to drive her 68-ton tank through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, while under heavy enemy fire, to save 6 men she had never met. The preparation was quick, but thorough. Maria checked every system on her tank twice. The engine, transmission, tracks, and weapons all had to be in perfect working condition. She loaded extra ammunition for the main gun and machine guns, knowing she would likely face heavy resistance. As she climbed into the driver's seat, Maria thought about her father back in Texas. He had always told her that machines were only as good as the people operating them. Today, his daughter would prove that lesson in the most dangerous way possible. The engine roared to life, and Maria began the most important drive of her life. Through hell and high water, the tank lurched forward as Maria guided it out of the forward operating base. She had studied the terrain maps carefully, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of driving a 68-ton machine through the Afghan mountains. The first challenge came immediately as she approached a steep ravine that blocked the direct path to the SEAL team. Maria downshifted the massive tank and approached the edge carefully. The drop was nearly 20 feet straight down, followed by an equally steep climb on the other side. Most drivers would have turned back, but Maria understood her machine's capabilities better than anyone. She had spent 3 years maintaining these tanks and knew exactly what they could handle. The tank tilted forward dramatically as it began descending into the ravine. Maria felt her stomach drop as the horizon disappeared, and all she could see was rocky ground rushing toward her. The tank's tracks found purchase on the steep slope, and she managed to control the descent without losing traction. Meanwhile, Morrison and his team were fighting for their lives on the mountainside. The Taliban fighters had grown bolder as the morning progressed, moving closer to the SEAL position. Morrison could see enemy muzzle flashes from at least 12 different positions surrounding their rocky shelter. Petty Officer First Class Danny Chun was the team medic, and he was working frantically to treat the wounded men. The shoulder wound was serious but manageable, but the shrapnel injury was getting worse. Blood loss was becoming a major concern, and Chun was running low on medical supplies. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice as he called back to base. His situation report was grim. The enemy was preparing for a coordinated assault from multiple directions. His team had enough ammunition for maybe 20 more minutes of intense fighting. After that, they would be forced to engage in hand-to-hand combat with overwhelming numbers of enemy fighters. Maria heard Morrison's report through her tank's communication system. She pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing her tank to its mechanical limits. The engine temperature was rising as she climbed out of the ravine, but she could not afford to slow down. Every minute of delay meant the SEALs were closer to being overrun. The terrain became even more challenging as she gained elevation. Massive boulders blocked the path, forcing Maria to navigate around obstacles that would have stopped most vehicles. She used her tank's dozer blade to push smaller rocks out of the way, carving a new path through the mountainside. Taliban scouts spotted the tank when Maria was still 2 miles from the SEAL position. The enemy fighters could not believe what they were seeing. No one had ever attempted to drive a main battle tank through this impossible terrain. Their surprise quickly turned to alarm as they realized the implications of an American tank approaching their positions. The first rocket-propelled grenade exploded against a rock formation just 50 feet from Maria's tank. The concussion wave rattled her teeth, but the tank continued moving forward. She could see the smoke trail from where the RPG had been fired and immediately swiveled her main gun in that direction. Maria had trained on tank gunnery, but she had never fired the main gun in combat. Her hands were steady as she lined up the shot using the tank's advanced targeting system. The 120mm cannon roared to life, sending a high-explosive round directly into the Taliban firing position. The explosion echoed through the mountains as enemy fighters scattered for cover. But more RPGs were already incoming. Maria had to keep moving to avoid becoming a stationary target. She maneuvered the tank behind a large rock formation just as two more grenades exploded where she had been seconds earlier. Pieces of shrapnel bounced harmlessly off the tank's thick armor. The Taliban fighters were now fully aware that their plans had changed dramatically. They had been preparing to overwhelm 6 trapped Americans, but now they faced a main battle tank that was systematically destroying their positions. Some fighters began retreating to more defensible locations, while others tried to coordinate anti-tank attacks. Morrison could hear the sounds of tank cannon fire getting closer to his position. He had no idea who was driving the rescue vehicle, but he knew that someone was fighting their way through enemy positions to reach his team. The sound of battle was moving up the mountainside in their direction. Maria encountered her most difficult obstacle, yet as she approached the final ridge before the SEAL position. A narrow mountain pass was the only way forward, but Taliban fighters had positioned themselves on both sides with perfect fields of fire. She would have to drive through a gauntlet of enemy weapons to reach the trapped Americans. She studied the terrain through her periscope and made a tactical decision that would have seemed insane to most people. Instead of trying to sneak through the pass, Maria decided to go over the top. She would drive her tank straight up the nearly vertical rock face of the ridge. The tank's tracks began climbing the impossible slope as Maria applied full power to the engine. Rock and dust flew everywhere as the steel tracks bit into the mountainside. The tank was tilted at such an extreme angle that Maria felt like she was driving straight up into the sky. Taliban fighters on both sides of the pass opened fire with everything they had. Bullets bounced off the tank's armor like raindrops, but the psychological impact was intense. Maria could hear the constant pinging and clanging of small arms fire against her vehicle. She knew that if the tank lost traction and slid backward, she would roll down the mountainside to certain death. The engine was screaming at maximum RPMs as the tank clawed its way up the vertical rock face. Steam began pouring from the engine compartment as the cooling system struggled to keep up with the massive power demands. Maria ignored the warning lights flashing on her dashboard and continued climbing. Halfway up the ridge, the tank's left track began slipping on loose rock. For a terrifying moment, the entire machine tilted sideways toward a 1,000-foot drop. Maria compensated by shifting her weight and adjusting the power distribution between the tracks. Slowly, painfully, the tank regained its grip on the mountainside. Morrison watched in amazement as an American tank appeared to be driving straight up the cliff face behind the Taliban positions. He had never seen anything like it in 15 years of military service. The enemy fighters were so focused on the impossible sight of a tank climbing a vertical mountain that they momentarily stopped shooting at the trapped SEALs. Maria finally reached the top of the ridge after 10 minutes of the most intense driving of her life. The tank crested the summit and, suddenly, found itself looking down at the Taliban positions from above. The enemy fighters had never considered that a tank might approach from this direction, and they were completely exposed to her weapons. But Maria's problems were far from over. The engine was overheating badly, and she could smell burning oil inside the tank. Several warning systems were indicating critical mechanical problems. She had pushed her machine beyond its design limits, and it was starting to fail at the worst possible moment. The SEALs were just 500 yards away, but they might as well have been on the other side of the world if her tank broke down now. Maria made a split-second decision that would determine whether her desperate rescue mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. #victory against all odds. Maria ignored the warning lights and pushed her failing tank forward down the reverse slope of the ridge. Black smoke was pouring from the engine compartment, and she could feel the machine losing power with every passing second. But she was committed now, and 6 American lives depended on her reaching them before the tank died completely. The Taliban fighters below were in complete chaos. They had positioned themselves to attack the SEALs from elevated positions, but now they found themselves trapped in the low ground with an American tank firing down at them from above. Their carefully planned ambush had turned into a nightmare as Maria's main guns systematically destroyed their fighting positions. Morrison rallied his men as he saw the tank approaching their position. The wounded SEALs were helped to their feet, while the others provided covering fire against the remaining enemy fighters. Sean, the medic, gathered his medical supplies and prepared to move the injured men as soon as the tank reached them. Maria's tank was running on fumes and determination as she navigated the final descent toward the SEAL position. The engine temperature gauge was deep in the red zone, and she could hear mechanical grinding sounds that meant serious internal damage. But the tank was still moving, and that was all that mattered. A Taliban fighter emerged from behind a rock with an RPG aimed directly at her tank. Maria saw him through her periscope and swiveled the machine gun in his direction. The burst of heavy machine gun fire cut down the enemy fighter before he could launch his rocket. The RPG exploded harmlessly against the rocks where he fell. But more enemy fighters were moving to intercept the tank before it could reach the Americans. Maria could see at least 8 Taliban fighters repositioning themselves between her tank and the SEAL team. They were armed with RPGs, assault rifles, and what appeared to be a recoilless rifle that could potentially damage her tank. The engine finally began failing as Maria approached the final 100 yards. The tank lurched forward in fits and starts as the transmission struggled to transfer power to the tracks. Warning alarms were blaring inside the crew compartment, and the smell of burning metal filled the air. Maria made the decision to abandon mechanical caution and give the engine everything it had left. She floored the accelerator and charged directly at the enemy positions at maximum speed. The 68-ton tank became a guided missile aimed at the heart of the Taliban defensive line. The enemy fighters scattered as the massive tank bore down on them. 2 of them tried to stand their ground and fire their weapons, but they were crushed beneath the tank's tracks before they could reload. The recoilless rifle position was overrun so quickly that the crew had no time to aim their weapon. Morrison and his team were ready when the tank crashed through the enemy line and skidded to a stop just 20 feet from their position. The tank's engine was making horrible grinding noises, and steam was pouring from multiple places in the engine compartment. But Maria had made it. The tank's rear hatch flew open and Maria emerged, covered in grease and sweat, but very much alive. She immediately began helping the wounded SEALs into the tank while Morrison and his men provided security. The enemy fighters who had survived the tank charge were regrouping for another attack. Getting 6 full-grown Special Forces operators into a tank designed for a 4-man crew was like solving a 3-dimensional puzzle. The wounded men had to be carefully positioned to avoid aggravating their injuries. Chun worked frantically to stabilize his patients while bullets began hitting the tank's exterior as the Taliban fighters resumed their attack. Maria climbed back into the driver's seat and tried to start the engine. Nothing happened on the first attempt. The second try produced only grinding sounds and clouds of black smoke. The third attempt was successful, but the engine was clearly running on borrowed time. The return journey was a race against mechanical failure and enemy pursuit. Maria could see Taliban fighters following the tank on foot, trying to get close enough to attack with grenades and RPGs. But the tank still had enough power to stay ahead of them, at least for now. The descent down the mountainside was terrifying with a failing engine and an overloaded crew compartment. Maria had to use engine braking and careful track control to prevent the tank from sliding out of control down the steep slopes. The overloaded suspension system groaned under the extra weight of 6 additional passengers. Halfway down the mountain, the engine finally seized completely. The tank coasted to a stop on a narrow ledge with a 1,000-foot drop on one side and vertical rock face on the other. Maria tried repeatedly to restart the engine, but the machine was mechanically dead. Morrison assessed their tactical situation through the tank's periscope. They were stranded in a highly defensible position, but Taliban fighters would eventually find ways to attack them. The tank's weapons still functioned even though the engine was dead, which gave them significant firepower advantages. But rescue was already on the way. Colonel Hayes had been monitoring the radio communications throughout the entire mission. When Maria's tank stopped responding, she immediately dispatched 2 Apache helicopter gunships to provide air support and extraction capabilities. The helicopters arrived just as Taliban fighters began advancing on the disabled tank. The Apache crews could see the enemy fighters moving through the rocks and immediately engaged them with cannon fire and Hellfire missiles. The remaining Taliban fighters quickly retreated to avoid the devastating air attacks. A medical evacuation helicopter followed the Apaches and managed to land on a small flat area near the tank. The wounded SEALs were quickly transferred to the helicopter and flown to a field hospital for treatment. Both men would make full recoveries from their injuries. Maria and the remaining SEALs were extracted by the second Apache helicopter using rescue harnesses. As they lifted off, Maria looked down at her disabled tank sitting alone on the mountainside. The machine that had carried them through impossible terrain would have to be abandoned, but it had served its purpose perfectly. The tank was later recovered by a specialized heavy-lift helicopter and returned to the forward operating base. The mechanical damage was extensive but reparable. Maria spent the next week rebuilding the engine that had carried her through the most dangerous mission of her military career. Morrison and his team nominated Maria for the Silver Star Medal for her extraordinary heroism under fire. The citation read that she had single-handedly rescued 6 Special Forces operators by driving a main battle tank through impossible terrain while under heavy enemy fire. Her actions had turned a certain disaster into a successful rescue mission. 6 months later, Maria was promoted to Sergeant First Class and assigned to train other tank crews in advanced off-road operations. Her techniques for navigating extreme terrain became part of the official training curriculum for armored units deploying to Afghanistan. Morrison stayed in contact with Maria long after their shared experience in the mountains. He often said that she had redefined what was possible when courage met mechanical expertise. The impossible had become possible because one woman refused to accept that 6 good men were going to die on her watch. Maria eventually left the military and returned to Texas, where she opened her own automotive repair shop. But she never forgot the day when she proved that determination and mechanical knowledge could overcome any obstacle. The SEALs had given up hope until she rolled her tank over that ridge and changed everything. Years later, when people asked Maria about her famous rescue mission, she would always say the same thing. The tank did not save those men by itself. It was just a machine made of steel and mechanical parts. What saved them was the willingness of people to risk everything for each other when it mattered most. The story became legend in military circles, but Maria remained humble about her role in the mission. She understood that she had simply been in the right place with the right skills when 6 brave men needed help. Any good soldier would have done the same thing if they had the knowledge and opportunity. But Colonel Hayes knew better. In her final report on the incident, she wrote that Sergeant Rodriguez had demonstrated the highest levels of technical competence, tactical thinking, and personal courage under impossible circumstances. Her actions had not only saved 6 lives, but had also expanded the understanding of what armored vehicles could accomplish in extreme terrain. The mountain ridge where Maria's tank had appeared still bears scorch marks from the battle. Local villagers sometimes point out the impossible route that the American tank had taken to reach the trapped soldiers. They call it the path that could not be traveled, except by someone who refused to believe in impossible things.